In this module, we will now turn our attention to the constructivist models of marriage and family therapy. Note that we are moving away from a Lockean perspective to that of a Kantian perspective with this shift. We will focus on DeShazer's solution-focused model, Michael White and David Epstein's narrative model, the feminist model, and then the collaborative language model. Let's now join the workshop.
Okay, we're going to shift now to solution-focused family therapy. So, what are we crossing now when we get into solution-focused? Okay, we're going to the whole social constructivist or postmodern component of things. Which means what? Nothing. No, it means something. Beats me. It's after lunch. Okay, what it means is that all of a sudden we're starting to note that there is a constructivist perspective when it comes to reality. And Steve DeShazer was fond of saying what? That language is reality. Hence, what we speak about determines what we believe to be real. He said that there are no wet beds, there are no stubborn children, there's only talk about wet beds and stubborn children. Okay? So what's the goal of solution-focused? It's to change the talk. Okay? It's to change the talk from what? Problem-saturated talk to solution-focused talk. Okay? Now, this is the model that obviously is managed care's darling. And why does managed care love this so much? Certainly brief. So I come to you as a solution-focused therapist, and I'm having some motivational problems in my life. I'm not really getting up and going to work as often as I should. And what's the solution-focused therapist going to look for? Exceptions to the problem. Okay, and what are they going to do first? They're going to go through the first session formula task. First session formula task, which does what? First session formula task does it ends up sort of creating the possibility to sort of note exceptions to the problem.
Notice when the problem isn't.
To notice points in a person's life where the problem is not existing. Okay? In other words, the first session formula task is asking people to go back in their life and note this is the only place that the solution-focused model takes a little historical journey. It's always otherwise present, here and now, and future-oriented. But it says, would you take just a look back, and is there anything in your life that you would not want to change? Okay? That's the first formula session task. So what this model is really doing is that it's looking at sort of how we think about things, how we sort of look at reality as being something that is either problem-saturated, full of problems, it's sort of a glass full, half empty kind of perspective on life. If we see the glass as half empty, we then sort of live a life of half empty. If we see the glass as half full, we live a life that has much more of a solution-oriented, of possibilities built in. One of the things that this model really does critique is that when you focus on the problem rather than exceptions to the problem, you're ending up further saturating the problem. So you want to focus on solutions. So it's very critical of MRI, which is looking at the attempted solution being the problem. Remember, Steve DeShazer studied under Václavic and the MRI model, but he said, I want to take this further. I don't want to look for attempted solutions. I want to look for exceptions to the problem, places where there are already strengths. So if I come to you as a solution-focused therapist with a problem, you're going to say, well, that's all well and good. Look at all these other things in your life that are going really well. Now, has anyone ever heard of the Family Preservation Project? Family Preservation Project. Maybe some of you are being funded through those sources if you're doing home-based family therapy work. The Family Preservation Project is really sort of using solution-focused frameworks in building strengths in families, sort of looking for the strengths that already exist in families. And there's a lot of federal money that's come down to working with families to build their strengths rather than to look for problems. Now, another reason why I think insurance companies like this model is that you are not really sort of focusing directly on a problem. You're focusing, kind of going around, circumventing the problem, and just noting how that person or family system is doing well in all the other aspects of their lives. There's a real de-emphasis on history. Okay, the the model itself is really looking for, sort of aspects of a family's life that are going on currently and in the future. And there's a certain deconstruction, if you will, of the reality of families in terms of how they have used language to hold the family in a sort of problem-oriented stance. You're looking for finding out times when the problem is not a problem, and times when the focus of the family is really on sort of aspects of how they are able to sort of build solutions into their lives, note aspects of their lives when these solutions are beginning to somehow take further hold of their lives. Now, we use something called the exception questions. Okay, so what's an exception question?
Is there a time in your life when the problem wasn't as bad?
Right. Okay, so you would look for exceptions to the problem and identifying those exceptions to when the problem did not have such a force. We would use things in this model that we'd name as scaling questions, wouldn't we? Okay, and what's a scaling question? And how's it used? Okay, sort of like what I did with your anxiety levels, right? On a scale of 1 to 10, how much of a problem is this? And you use scaling questions oftentimes to denote just subtle distinctions of improvement and change. Okay, so you're really trying to get people to peg where they are. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how depressed were you, when you came in today? And now, after talking about these solutions, on a scale of 1 to 10, have you seen any shifts in that? Okay, so you're really looking for changes.
What would it take to move you from a 5 to a 6?
Or what would it? Yep. Or what would it take to move you from a 5 to a 6? How would that look? Now, this is similar to Peggy Papp's work in fast future tracking, isn't it? So what ends up happening with fast future tracking is you're trying to ground in the future a sense of what change would look like and how would we recognize this, which is sort of the basis, if you will, for the miracle question. Okay? Now, this model really is looking at sort of, again, the theory of dysfunction really centers around people sort of attributing the focus on the problem as being attributing to the limitations that they're able to sort of, that's not said well. Let me say it again. This is a model that's really focusing on that takes the focus on the problem, shifting it to focus on solutions and exceptions to the problem in order to really sort of create a whole range of possibilities that sort of create directions that the family hasn't been able to really sort of develop on their own. And again, DeShazer talks about the issue of language, meaning that if you approach things from one therapist's point of view, it's going to be a language that's going to be the language you understand the problem through. What you're going to try to do is actually, with this model, to try to co-construct language in a world of possibilities rather than in just sort of being problem-saturated in limitations. So you find where the problem's not a problem, again, looking for exceptions. You generate a series of solutions. And then your role as a therapist is to expand the range of those solutions and take it a step further or 2 steps further. The miracle question. Could someone give me an example of how the miracle question is actually said? Anyone know it? Go ahead.
If you wake up in the morning and all your problems are gone, what would be different?
Okay. So it's said with a little bit more sort of length to it. And they put a lot of emphasis on the actual language of it. Okay? If you were to fall asleep tonight, okay, and while you were sleeping, a miracle happened, and what? How do they say it next? And this problem was not all, but this problem was no longer in effect. Okay, what would be the first thing you would notice tomorrow morning after you woke that would tell you that the miracle had happened? Okay.
What would other people notice?
I don't know that part actually, but then what would other people notice?
Then you would take it. Yeah, you would take it along, and how? So how would you notice? And so then it would. Okay, so now it's happening, and what would other people notice, so that you get a little bit of a meta perspective?
Okay.
Start looking at
Okay. Yes. Okay. That makes sense. So what ends up happening then is that. So what would you notice, and then what would other people notice about you and the way you're approaching or living your life, or the way you're behaving, that would further reinforce the fact that the miracle did happen?
So it would feel different, and then how would it look different?
Okay. So it's having sort of the internal experience, but also enveloping it into a meta experience in the whole thing. Okay. It's having that meta perspective filtrate in as well. Okay. So one of the things that this model is also is very brief. And what you're trying to do in terms of the stages is that you explore what has been used for solutions in the past, because you don't want to try to replicate something that hasn't been used. You identify exceptions. And what you're doing through the miracle question is that you're establishing the goal and then grounding that in the future in terms of how they are going to be able to notice that they've actually reached that goal. You discuss feedback on that formula first session task. And by doing that, what you're doing is you're trying to, again, establish what already is working within the system. You're trying to sort of identify those exceptions. And you're using a lot of sort of complimenting, you're using a lot of support, and you're using a lot of salesmanship. I kind of call this model the Dale Carnegie model of family therapy, because what are you doing? You're selling hope. Okay? You're selling another way of looking at the world that really is a hopeful way. And a lot of it depends on the therapist's ability to sort of present positive solutions and possibilities in a very positive way. That really makes the difference with this model. It's about the relationship. Steve DeShazer used to say that it's really about the relationship between the therapist and the client. And it's that relationship and the positive aspects of that relationship and the hopeful aspects of that relationship that increase the client's capacity to feel good about their lives and sort of move towards those solutions. Okay? DeShazer also talked about the notion that this model sort of bypasses resistance and talked about the death of resistance. And it's a session that, it's a therapy rather, that really is allowing people to circumvent where they get stuck in their lives. The question, though, that I have is that does it really create a level of transformation with people? It's an interesting question. If we go back to that chart I put up earlier in terms of it being symptom relief, I think it kind of does land itself pretty much in symptom relief or symptom bypassing. But the belief, again, is that it creates sort of another way or a more positive, a more complex belief system that allows people to solve problems with the successes that they have just accomplished. The stance of the therapist is very directive. They tend to be very much in control of the session. And they're always in the position of facilitating a conversation that is oriented to solutions and to steering the conversation away from problems. You're looking for, in terms of techniques, you're looking for exceptions. You're using formula first session task, scaling questions, miracle questions, more of the same, complimenting people. Okay. All right, let's make a shift now to the narrative model. Okay, so we're going to change the way we're thinking. So the narrative model of family therapy, the key theorists are Michael White and David Epson. Okay? And this is a model that really looks at the co-construction of reality. Remember I mentioned before that when we go to a place where we don't know people and people say, hey, so what do you do? It's a chance for us to tell the story of who we are. We all have stories about ourselves. And these stories really allow us to sort of present ourselves in ways that emphasize aspects of who we are, but don't necessarily sort of have to say every single thing about us. We can emphasize a part of us that's very strong, that's very creative, that's funny, that's competent, or we can talk about parts of ourselves that are more subjugated, parts of ourselves that hold us down. Okay? We're looking in this model to really increase flexibility, and we're looking to really generate a lot of creativity in the expression of self. Okay? Language is essential, and the way we tell the story and the way we get to our dominant stories in this model is critical. What is one's dominant story? Can someone give me an example of a dominant story that you might have? Anybody have a dominant story? I tell people, one of my dominant stories is that, I can fix most things that break. My dad could fix most things that break. I can fix most things that break. When if my dishwasher breaks, it's, much to my wife's chagrin, it's out on the kitchen floor and I've got parts, and I'm replacing parts rather than calling somebody in. Or I can build things. But the point is that's part of my dominant story. Another dominant story in my world was that this is sort of how dominant stories get passed down from generation to generation. There's a story in my family of my grandfather, my great-grandfather, who lived in England. And as the story goes, a bull had broken away from the farmer and was running down the street in Long Eaton, England. And a little girl was playing in the street. And my great-grandfather was a blacksmith for the railroad. He ran out, grabbed the bull by the horns, wrestled it to the ground, and saved the little girl's life. Okay? Now, probably what really happened was that a cow had broken off from the farmer and was walking down the street. And my grandfather probably grabbed the chain, great-grandfather grabbed the chain and led the cow away. Okay. However, that story gets passed down as a dominant story in our family. And so what you find in my family, from my grandfather to my father to myself, is that when something crazy happens, we jump in the middle of it and we address it rather than just stand by as bystanders from the whole thing. Okay? So that's an example of a dominant story in somebody's life that can get passed down from generation to generation to generation. What you find, though, is that sometimes people have subjugated stories that become their dominant stories. Subjugated stories that really hold people down, and so that people are sort of held prisoner to stories about themselves as they're not being smart, or they're not being capable, or they're not being lovable, or they're being unable to do math. People tell stories about themselves, and they start telling that story over and over again, and that story holds them down. So that what we're trying to do is in this sort of model is really sort of identify dominant stories, see if it's a functional one or not, and then we're trying to figure out, okay, so what's the problem being identified? And so we come up with when we're working with people from the narrative model, we come up with a way of trying to identify what the problem is. What do we do once we identify the problem? We externalize the problem. We externalize the problem, okay? How do we do that? We personify it. We give it proper noun status. I bring it to sort of like a poltergeist status, where, in a sense, what happens is everyone knows what a poltergeist is. It's kind of like a spirit, right? I sort of say anger is in the room, and now anger is telling you something. What do you want to say back to anger? And so that personification, or that sort of externalizing it, becomes anger now has been sort of withdrawn, externalized from the person. And now we have anger we don't have an angry person, okay? We don't have someone that is just behaving badly. We have anger in the room telling that person. So how are you listening to anger? So I have a client that is been working with her now for 7 years, and she was a cutter, and she used to burn herself with cigarettes and dump boiling water on her. Was sexually abused when she was a young kid. Was to be an Olympic swimmer, and then it all fell apart. So what ended up happening is that what I identified is that craziness, and I call it craziness, takes hold of her sometimes. And craziness leads her to numb out, tells her to numb out, and when she numbs out, she doesn't feel anything, and she knows she needs to feel something rather, so she hurts herself. So we created this alternative story to the way that she had been thinking about it. And so when craziness talks, we come up with strategies for her to respond, to not listen to craziness. So from this model, what I did was I externalized craziness, okay, because she was behaving pretty crazy. And so we talk about, okay, so what's craziness saying to you now? Craziness says, I shouldn't talk to you right now. Well, what do you want to say back to craziness? So no longer is she just behaving crazy. She now has a dialogue with crazy, and she's distancing from that. In this model, what we're trying to do is we're trying to sort of get the problem outside of the individual such that we can do what? We can plan an escape meeting. Okay? An escape meeting is a moment where we plan with everyone in the family system how they are not going to listen to the problem. Now, remember when I talked about Milan systemic, that sometimes, not sometimes, but it's really important to sort of, like with a positive connotation, make sure that everyone is being sort of framed in a way where we are addressing the way in which the problem is talking to each member of the family. That we have to make sure that we're pulling everybody out of that recursive loop that maintains the problem and the problem's influence on the family. So what we're trying to do in this model is really, first of all, identify the problem, map the influence of the problem on every member of the family. Okay? So we're looking at generating a map that really shows how the problem is talking to mom, how the problem is talking to dad, to the kids, and that problem is now being pulled further out of the family. We're looking for moments in the session itself where the family is not listening to the problem, okay, or a member's not listening to the problem. We call that a sparkling moment or a unique outcome. Okay? When we see a unique outcome, what do? We ask the family to go back. We ask the family to go back and talk to someone, and this is the way Michael White words it, talk to someone who would be the least surprised at your ability to not listen to the problem, in this case craziness, the way you just did not listen to craziness. Who would be least surprised? So what are we building at that point? Alliances and a support system, what he calls the retribalization, by pulling together the community that supports the new dominant story and the escape from the subjugated story or from the craziness. Okay? So what's interesting about this model is that it really allows people to connect to their communities. Michael White was very big on connecting people with bulimia with other people with bulimia in his practice and other people with bulimia so that they could share their successes in regards to escaping from being under the influence of the problem. Okay? It's a model that is very, very powerful in working with people. Has anyone ever used it? What has your experience been?
Well, I'm an expressive arts therapist, so I use all of these modalities through art forms. But I do this a lot. I work with addiction. I do this a lot, personifying addiction through drawing, through role play, and through drama therapies. And it's incredibly impactful to all of a sudden. It's not my voice that tells me to take a drink or to shoot up. It's the voice of the addict, who I'm very now familiar with, who has a name and a voice.
Yeah. Sometimes you actually identify, a gender to the voice. You try to really give it a real persona, such that the person is able to have a true dialogue with it. It's a very, very powerful tool in your arsenal. And one of the things that you want to pay attention to is that this is not for the test, but just for your practice in general. There's a way in which being an integrative therapist, someone that actually can pull from all the different models, not in an eclectic way, but rather in an integrative way such that they all fit together. That is a very powerful way of doing therapy. And the narrative model and the ability to externalize problems is a very profound set of tools to help people sort of escape from being under the influence of that voice or that problem, separate from it, collapse time. What's collapsing time in this model? Not looking at the history of the problem in the person, but just taking it into the here and now. Okay? That's the collapsing time. And then planning an escape meeting. So if we move along in this model and look at sort of the stages of therapy, we identify the problem and externalize it. We chart or map the relative influence of the problem. We collapse time, which is to sort of diminish the historic history of it. We raise dilemmas, which means what? Sort of give an occurrence or an incidence where the problem might come up again and how we're going to deal with it. We in a sense, predict its voice coming back up and what are we going to do about it. We set experiments saying, okay, we want to bring it back up again and we want to bring addiction out again. How are you going to deal with it? We plan for it. And the therapy, again, tends to be pretty short-term because of that. But Michael White was very interested in sort of the whole tribal or communal aspect of change as well. And David Epson adds the whole element of letter writing to this, such that after every session, David Epson, what would he do? He would sort of do a recapitalization or a reframe of what occurred in the session and really highlight those unique outcomes, those moments when the person was not listening to the problem. Right? And this is, if you remember my story about the woman that was psychotic and coming into Michael White's office, Michael White was a genius at being able to sort of generate that sparkling moment and notice it where that problem was externalized and the person could really have a new story emerge. And that's what we're trying to do. And do you see the connection, though, between the narrative model and solution-focused? It really is sort of a way in which the solution-focused model evolved to, instead of exceptions to the problem, we're now looking at sort of exceptions to the subjugated story. We're taking the story and we're actively taking responsibility in narrating or telling that story and then connecting people up in their world, much like the solution-focused model does too, in terms of just connecting people up in the world that are going to reinforce the positive changes that have been made. Okay? So that's our narrative model. Collaborative language. The collaborative language model is, again, as I said earlier, it's sort of the most postmodern of all our models. And what I mean by that is that we are completely non-experts. We sort of reject any kind of expert status, which was the model I talked about a little while ago that takes the highest degree of expert, Milan systemic. This is sort of the antithesis of that model. And so what we do here is that we're taking a position of not knowing. How does that work, a position of not knowing from the collaborative stance? Anyone? Go ahead.
You ask them questions. You act like they're the expert, the client's the expert, or they know their problem better than you. So you're finding out from them what it is. You're asking, what is that like for you? What does it look like?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting. Like you're acting very interested.
Okay, so what you're saying is that we trust our curiosity as a human being, as a person, and we don't come in with this notion that we can even help our clients. Rather, we're just curious about how they understand their problem, and we're really interested in the way they talk about their problem, the way they think about their problem, why they've come to see us. And as they're talking, what do we do from the collaborative language model? We pay attention to what is getting stirred up inside of us, and if it has relevance, mind you, it has to have relevance, we just can't go off on a tangent. If it has relevance to aspects of our own life, we bring that in too. And we draw analogies, we wonder with them, we in a sense become co-collaborators on defining what it is we're going to talk about, what the course of this therapy is actually going to, what the course we're going to follow for the therapy. Okay? We're making sure that it's a non-pathologizing perspective. We're being very concerned with any kind of language that would label this as a problem or pathologize it. Okay? We're interested in postmodern theory, which means what? Postmodern theory. It's a pretty broad notion. Okay? We're looking at sort of, again, that reality is created, okay, that the constructivist quality of reality. Anyone ever read any of Ken Gergen's works? Okay? Very interesting writing, isn't it? Phenomenal. He's the brother of David Gergen. It's like, interesting family. It's got to be. But anyway, Ken Gergen writes about something called the saturated self. That's an important concept that you might want to hold in your minds. The saturated self. And the saturated self speaks to the idea, it's a postmodern thought, that speaks to the idea that we are saturated. We are bombarded by so much sort of stimulus in our world. For instance, just listen to this room right now. We have a fan going on. We might hear voices outside. We're driving down the highway. We have billboards. We have the radio going. We have cars coming back and forth. You're probably listening to me talking on the tapes, in the CDs. You've got so much information coming at you that in our society today, we are saturated and we can't take it in anymore, like a sponge. And so what ends up happening is that we are losing things. We're not able to hold on to the essence of what life is like any longer because there's just too much information coming at us. And the whole notion of the postmodern perspective is that we really want to pay attention to sort of how we are choosing to construct a reality and the meanings we attach to it in terms of, are we just going to sort of allow capitalism to define who we are? Do we have any spirituality that we bring in on any levels? Do we look at sort of the meaning of ideas? How important are relationships? Why do we work in this profession to begin? You really want to sort of add some meaning to your life at that level. We're sort of shifting from a problem-determined system to a construction of possibilities, though we will problem solve in a collaborative way with our client systems when we're working from this model. We're looking at sort of dissolving the problem. How can we talk about a problem in a way to deconstruct it and to create other possibilities? We're also sort of, trying to really pay attention to how the use of language and teach how the use of language maintains a problem. Okay. The goal of this model is to generate new meaning around the problem and to support clients in their taking new action in terms of solving the problem. Okay? We think of change as being something that emanates from the conversation that we are having with our clients. And one of the things, as a collaborative language therapist myself, I won't ask my clients to do anything I can't do. So I had a client, a couple in the other day, that was talking about how their house is just in disarray. And as I mentioned before, you look around my office and I've got a few piles here and there. And I said, okay, here's the deal. If you guys start addressing this, I promise by the time you get back, I will clean up these piles right here. So I have to hold myself accountable at the same level clients are holding themselves accountable, and that speaks to a kind of genuineness in this kind of a model. It's also a model that lets you be a real person. And being a real person, as we know in a therapy, definitely decreases your tendency towards burnout. If you're always having to sort of speak from a model, if you're always having to be the one with the answers, you're not able to truly relax as a therapist to the same degree that you can just be a person who doesn't have any answers, who's also making it up, doing the best they can, and trying to somehow take it to a place where we agree on this is how we're going to focus on what it is you're calling a problem. Okay? So that recursiveness includes us. Stages of therapy, it's not really conceived in stages, but it's a continuous conversation or a process. We're paying attention to language and how we're speaking to each other. And it's a collaboration of ideas and experiences and feelings. It's a very real connection you're having with your clients. They're not your friends, but there's a friendly connection going on. We end the therapy when we both agree. Client system and us as therapists agree that it's time. It's ready to end this therapy. Stance is not knowing. We don't pretend to have answers. We're a good listener. We're responsive. We honor the client's reality. It's an egalitarian, and we're equal with them. We're compassionate. We're curious as we explore the possibilities. Okay. Techniques are just not knowing approach, using, again, that reflecting team, sort of wondering. When you think of the reflecting team in Tom Anderson's work, think of it just sort of the team posing questions that kind of wonder about things, and then the family sort of responding to that wondering. Okay? Sort of a shared inquiry. We focus on what the client system is presenting, and then we sort of, through the questions and through the dialectic that goes on, we then decide how the conversation and how the therapy is going to move along. Feminist family therapy. I'm not going to say too much about it, but I am going to say that it has some major concerns with marriage and family therapy because it finds that many marriage and family therapy models, in terms of the feminist model, they're missing the significance in the role of power and gender. Okay? Power and gender tend to be very critical issues in working with people. And if you don't address it, and if you don't address its potential impact, what ends up happening is that you're sort of just perpetrating sort of that imbalance in power between men and women. One of the things that we also critique marriage and family therapy from a feminist perspective is that we assume that men and women have equal power, and we don't. And so what we have to do is we have to make allowances and we have to adjust ourselves from the feminist model perspective accordingly. Okay? Traditional models don't really talk about power and gender, just like traditional family therapy models oftentimes don't talk about race. And so what we're trying to do in the feminist family therapy model is really bring gender and power into the conversation with our client systems to talk about it. These notions of an over-involved mother, it's very gender biased and, put a very large misunderstanding on sort of women's developmental issues. Women historically do place greater importance on connection. That shouldn't be pathologized as being over-involved. Men place greater emphasis on individuality. For the same reason, that shouldn't necessarily be pathologized as being uninvolved. And so men and women both are sort of caught under the are sort of held down by gender politics. Okay? It's a very social constructivist model because what we're doing is we're reconstructing our understanding of a lot of sort of the way the world is. The theory of dysfunction is that there is inequality of power in relationships. There just is. and we have to identify it. And we're looking for the power differentials as they relate to gender roles. So we're assessing that. How do we change it? We shift imbalances of power, recognizing that both men and women are victimized, as I said earlier. We recognize also that the effect of power has an effect on couple relationships, family relationships, and individual relationships. So what do? We initially build a collaborative therapeutic relationship. We begin to accentuate the gender and the power dynamics in the relationship. We talk about power, we talk about control, we talk about different perspectives from a gender perspective. We start exploring gender beliefs. What is it about men in this family? What is it about women in this family? How do roles or gender roles affect us? And then we start rebalancing the power. Now, the social constructivist part of this model is that what do? We always align with the person in this more submissive or the sort of the unequal power dynamic. Oftentimes it's the woman in a traditional couple. And so we rebalance it and we sort of align more with the sort of person that has the less power or the least power, and we hope that that then ripples out into society. So it's a very deliberate, constructed sort of shift in terms of how we align. We're not looking for, so to speak, fairness and equality. We're looking to, because typically in society men have more power than women. So what we're doing is we're rebalancing and giving women more power, and we're doing it in a way that we explain it sort of in a social constructivist way, that we're trying to also alter the way other people look at things. So we're trying to have boys be more emotionally expressive. We're having girls take on more responsibility in terms of kids inside of a family system. We're really trying to challenge the limitations that gender has placed on all our roles, men and women's roles. Okay. We construct a whole, sort of different way of sort of thinking about stance. How as a therapist do we actually position ourselves? I'll tell you a funny story. I was working with a Peruvian couple, and in the course of my first interview, I find out that the husband in this couple had been abusive to the wife, physically abusive, had been sexually abusive, and had actually raped her a few times. And I said, basically, this is unacceptable. This is absolutely unacceptable. And that we're going to address this, and I'm going to report aspects of this because it's completely unacceptable. Well, he reports me to the guardian ad litem, because they were in a custody battle for the kids, and said, he's a feminist. But what's interesting is that he reported me as if it was a derogatory term. And so then I had the guardian ad litem says, and he accused you of being a feminist. This was a woman saying this to me, and which really surprised me. Now, but you have to put it in perspective. It was also a woman who was a Latina, so that she had a different perspective on gender, and so and power, and she felt it was somehow reasonable on some level that power imbalance was there. Very interesting information. But the point of the matter is that if we take a position as a feminist, and frankly as a man, it's very powerful to take a position as a feminist. And it's just, people, when I use, name it in my therapies oftentimes with people, it's, they're surprised that, they think that it means I'm feminine. But it's wonderful, because it begins to talk, it brings the conversation to the forefront, and you can really start to explore gender politics. So the feminist model is really sort of looking at sort of a much more social constructivist stance of the therapist, and really sees you as a social change agent. You're empowering, you're collaborating, and you're also demystifying what you're doing. You don't hide behind the curtain and do this work. You say, look, this power imbalance is the way it is in life in terms of men having more power. We're going to do something about it. In our therapy, the way we're going to talk about it, we're going to make sure that doesn't happen. And this is the reason I'm going to actually, sort of set this up so that there's a little more power at the moment going over to the wife than it is to you, buddy. And this is going to, and really work on what that would mean. What would it mean? We do hypotheticals. How would that affect your life? And we start exploring the social constructivist possibilities. And again, it's very collaborative at that level.
In the last module of this virtual workshop series, we will explore the following models: internal family systems, the behavioral and cognitive behavioral model, the psychoeducational model, and the model of network family therapy.